The door that changed everything. She survived 5 years of war. She never expected to come home and find her entire life had been erased. Commander Lena Dawid had survived 3 combat deployments, 2 near-death experiences, and 1 particularly brutal winter in the North Atlantic, where the ocean itself seemed determined to swallow her ship whole. She had stared down admirals who doubted her, pirates who underestimated her, and storms that had no business being survived. She was the kind of woman who walked into impossible situations and walked back out carrying the impossible in her arms like it weighed nothing. But nothing, not one single moment in her decorated military career, had prepared her for the sight of a strange man answering the door of her own home. She stood on the porch of the house she had bought with her own money, the house where she had painted the nursery soft yellow because she didn't know yet whether the baby would be a boy or a girl, the house where she had kissed her husband David goodbye 5 years ago while he stood in the doorway with their 3-year-old daughter Maya on his hip. She stood there in her full dress uniform, medals catching the afternoon light, duffel bag at her feet, heart so full of coming home that she could barely breathe. And then the door opened. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing David's favourite weekend flannel shirt. He looked at her with polite confusion, the way you look at a stranger who has knocked on the wrong door and said, "Can I help you?" Lena's brain simply stopped working. She looked at the house number, 4412 Meridian Lane, her house, her numbers, her flowering rosebush that she had planted the spring before her first deployment, now grown enormous and sprawling beautifully along the left side of the porch railing. "I'm sorry, I live here." The man's expression shifted. Something crossed his face that she couldn't immediately name. Not quite guilt, not quite surprise, something careful and prepared like he had been expecting this moment and had rehearsed for it. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "I've lived here for 3 years." 3 years. 3 years, and Lena hadn't known. Couldn't have known, deployed in radio silence zones more often than not, communications restricted, David's emails growing shorter and less frequent until they simply stopped. But she had told herself that was deployment reality, that David understood, that he was managing, that her family was waiting. She had told herself that story every single night for 5 years because it was the only story that kept her standing. "Where is David Dawid?" she said. Her voice came out completely steady. "Military training doesn't abandon you even when your entire world is collapsing. Where is my husband? Where is my daughter?" The man opened the door wider. Behind him she could see her living room, her fireplace, her hardwood floors, her built-in bookshelves, but everything else was different. Different furniture, different art on the walls. A child's drawing taped to the fridge visible through the kitchen doorway, but not Maya's handwriting. Someone else's child, someone else's life installed inside the bones of hers. "Maybe you should come in," he said. She didn't move. "Answer my question." He exhaled. "David sold me this house 3 years ago. I'm Marcus Webb. I bought it through a realtor. Everything was completely legal. I have all the paperwork. I didn't know, I knew he was divorced. He told me his wife had." "His wife had what?" Marcus Webb looked deeply uncomfortable. "He told me his wife had died, overseas, that he was selling the family home because he couldn't bear the memories." The world tilted. Lena Dawid, Commander Lena Dawid, 15 years of naval service, 2 commendations for valor, a woman who had never once fainted in her life, grabbed the porch railing with both hands and held on. She found her mother first. Her mother, Elena Dawid, still living in the same small house 40 minutes away, who opened her door and screamed and grabbed Lena so hard that 2 of her medals pressed permanent impressions into both their chests. They stood in the doorway for a long time, her mother crying into her shoulder, repeating her name over and over like a prayer she hadn't been allowed to say in years. "He told us you were dead," Elena finally choked out. "Lena, he told us he came to us 2 years ago. He said there had been an incident, classified, that the Navy had informed him privately. He had papers, official-looking papers." "Forged," Lena said. Her voice was very quiet. "We had a memorial service." Her mother pulled back and looked at her face like she was still confirming she was real. "We buried an empty casket. Your father, Lena, your father's heart." "Mom," she grabbed her mother's hands. "Where is Maya?" Elena's face did something complicated and terrible. David remarried 8 months ago, a woman named Christine. They moved to Portland. He has full custody of Maya. He told the courts you were dead. Lena sat down on her mother's kitchen floor, not gracefully, just straight down like her legs made a unanimous decision without consulting her. She sat on the linoleum in her dress uniform with her medals and her 15 years of service, and she put her face in her hands. Her daughter had been growing up thinking her mother was dead. Maya was 8 years old now. She had been 3 when Lena deployed. She barely remembered her mother to begin with. 5 years of David telling her what? What had he told an 8-year-old girl about where her mother was? Lena sat on that floor for exactly 4 minutes. She knew because she counted. Then she stood up, smoothed her uniform and called her JAG officer. What followed was 36 hours that Lena would later describe to her therapist as a controlled explosion. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat more than what was strictly necessary to keep her functional. She moved through those hours the way she moved through crisis situations at sea, with complete focus, absolute economy of motion, and a cold clarity that frightened people who didn't know her and reassured people who did. Her JAG officer, Lieutenant Commander Reyes, listened to everything she said in silence, then said, "He committed fraud against the United States military, falsified death records, and likely committed perjury in the custody proceedings. Lena, this man is in serious trouble." "I don't want him in trouble," Lena said. "I want my daughter." "You'll get both." She hired a private investigator within the hour. By morning, she had David's address in Portland, his employer, his new wife's name, the school Maya attended, and a photograph, taken legally from public records, of her daughter at a school event 6 months ago. Maya at 8, dark-haired like her father but with Lena's jaw and Lena's eyes. Standing in front of a science fair project with a ribbon in her hand, looking so achingly proud of herself that Lena had to leave the room for 3 minutes before she could continue working. She drove to Portland herself. She didn't tell anyone she was coming. Her lawyer called ahead to Portland Family Court and filed an emergency motion that landed like a grenade. David opened his front door on a Tuesday morning and found his not-dead wife standing on his porch. He went the color of old paper. Lena had imagined this moment for the entire 6-hour drive. She had drafted speeches, rehearsed the quiet devastation she would deliver. She had planned to be articulate and precise and devastating in the controlled, professional way that 15 years of command had taught her. Instead, she looked at him, David, who she had loved, who she had trusted with her child, who had stood in that doorway 5 years ago with Maya on his hip, and waved goodbye with tears in his eyes, and she said, "Where is she?" "Lena," his voice cracked. "Lena, I thought." "You thought nothing, you knew exactly what you were doing. Every step of it was deliberate." She stepped forward. He stepped back automatically and she walked into the house. "I need to see my daughter, right now. Before I say another word to you, before the lawyers arrive, before the police, because they are coming, David, all of them are coming, I need to see Maya." "She's at school." "Then we are going to her school." "You can't just..." "I am her mother." Her voice didn't rise. It dropped the way it did on the ship when she was most serious, and every officer under her command knew that drop meant the conversation was over. "I am alive. I have identification, I have my service record, I have my fingerprints and my DNA and 15 years of documented existence. You told a court I was dead. You forged military paperwork. You let my daughter believe her mother was buried in an empty grave." She held his gaze. "We are going to her school, and you are going to stand next to me when she sees me for the first time. Because whatever happens to you next, and David, I promise you, a great deal is about to happen to you, you owe her that. You owe her the truth from your own mouth, standing right beside me." Something in him collapsed. She watched it happen, watched 5 years of constructed lies buckle under the weight of her simply being alive and standing in his living room. He had built an entire architecture of deception, new wife, new home, custody, a death certificate, a memorial, and now the foundation was gone. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know," she said, "let's go." Maya was in 3rd grade. Her classroom had paper butterflies on the windows and a reading corner with a beanbag chair and a hamster named Captain Crunch in a cage near the door. The school principal brought Maya to a private room, the family resource room, with soft chairs and a box of tissues on the table that suddenly seemed very purposeful. And when Maya walked in and saw her father standing there with a woman in a naval uniform, she stopped. She had her father's dark hair. She had Lena's jaw, Lena's eyes, and apparently Lena's instinct for reading a room, because she looked at that woman in the uniform and something moved across her 8-year-old face that was too complicated for an 8-year-old face to contain. "Maya," David said, his voice destroyed, This is your mom." The silence lasted 2 seconds. Then Maya said very quietly, "Mommy." And Lena Dawid, who had not cried once in 36 hours, who had been a controlled explosion through every legal call and every devastating revelation, and the 6-hour drive and David's paper-white face and every single moment of it, dropped to her knees on the carpet of the family resource room and said, "Yes, baby, it's me, I'm right here, I came home." Maya crossed the room in 4 steps and hit her like a wave. The legal proceedings took 4 months. They were not gentle. David was charged with filing a false report, fraud, perjury in family court, and 3 additional charges that his lawyer spent considerable energy trying to reduce. The forged military death notification, which investigators discovered he had paid a disgraced former military clerk to produce, added federal charges to the list. His new wife, Christine, who had known nothing and was as horrified as anyone, separated from him within 2 weeks of the story breaking. The custody ruling was not complicated. Lena was alive. She had never relinquished parental rights. The previous custody order had been obtained through deliberate fraud upon the court. Maya was returned to her mother's legal custody within 6 weeks, with a family court judge making very pointed remarks on the record about the gravity of what had been done. Lena took family leave. The Navy, to their considerable credit, gave her everything she asked for. She found a small house near her mother's. Yellow kitchen, big backyard, a room for Maya that Maya got to design herself, and which ended up being a spectacular collision of navy blue walls, glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, and approximately 40 stuffed animals arranged in a military formation that Maya called the fleet. "Who taught you to line them up like that?" Lena asked the first night, standing in the doorway watching Maya organize her fleet with tremendous seriousness. Maya looked up. "Dad always said you were a commander. He said you were in charge of a whole ship." A pause. "Is that true?" "It's true. Did you like it?" Lena came in and sat on the edge of the bed. "I loved it, but I like this more." She nodded at the stuffed animal fleet. "Your formation needs work, though. Your left flank is completely exposed." Maya stared at her, then looked at her stuffed animals, then back at her mother. "Can you help me fix it?" They spent an hour reorganizing the fleet. Maya asked 14 questions about ships and the ocean, and whether Lena had ever seen a shark, and what the loudest sound on a ship was, and whether the stars looked different over the ocean than they did from land. Lena answered every single one. That was the night, sometime around the 43rd question, with Maya finally asleep against her shoulder in a small yellow-lit room full of glow stars and a properly secured stuffed animal defensive perimeter, that Lena cried. Finally, fully, the kind of crying that had been waiting 36 hours and 4 months and 5 years to happen. She sat in her daughter's room in the dark and cried until she was completely empty, and then she held her daughter tighter and breathed. Her mother asked her once, late one evening when Maya was asleep and they were sitting on Lena's new porch with tea, whether she would go back. To the Navy, to the ship, to the career she had built so carefully for so long. Lena thought about it honestly. She thought about the ocean and the way command felt, the weight of it and the purpose of it, the particular satisfaction of being exactly where you were built to be. She thought about her officers, her crew, the work that she genuinely loved. "Not for a while," she said, "maybe not in the same way." She looked out at the quiet street. "I missed 5 years I can't get back. I'm not going to miss any more of her." Her mother nodded, didn't push. "He thought," Lena said slowly, "that declaring me dead would make it true. That if he built enough reality on top of the lie, the house, the courts, the new marriage, the story he told Maya, that eventually the lie would just become what happened." She turned her tea mug in her hands. "He didn't count on me coming home." "He should have," Elena said simply. "He knew who you were." Lena smiled. It was the first real smile, not the controlled professional expression she'd been managing for months, but the actual one. "Yeah," she said, "he should have." 6 months after Lena came home, on a Saturday morning with rain on the windows and Maya in the kitchen demanding pancakes, shaped like ships because apparently this was now a tradition, and there was no negotiating it. Lena stood at the stove in an old Navy sweatshirt with a spatula in her hand, trying to produce a credible aircraft carrier out of pancake batter. Maya stood on a step stool beside her, extremely invested in the process, offering tactical suggestions about the batter distribution that were surprisingly sensible. "The flight deck needs to be flat," Maya said. "I know. Yours is lumpy. I'm working on it." You commanded a whole ship in real life, and you can't make a pancake ship." Lena turned and looked at her daughter, 8 years old, dark-haired, using her mother's exact tone of voice to deliver this critique, and started laughing. Really laughing, the kind that takes over completely until she had to set the spatula down. Maya looked enormously pleased with herself. "Come here," Lena said, and pulled her into a hug right there at the stove with the lumpy aircraft carrier slowly overcooking behind them. She held her daughter in her old navy sweatshirt on a rainy Saturday morning in their small yellow kitchen house and thought, This is what I was dreaming about for 5 years. Not the house, not the furniture, not any of the things David took and replaced and rearranged. Just this. The pancake burned. Maya found it completely hilarious. Lena made 6 more attempts before she produced something that Maya generously certified as maybe a battleship if you kind of squint. And they ate them at the kitchen table with too much syrup, while the rain came down outside and Captain Crunch. Yes, Maya had negotiated custody of the classroom hamster for the summer. And yes, Lena had somehow agreed to this, rustled contentedly in his cage in the corner. Outside, the world continued to be complicated and unjust and full of people who would rather build lies than face hard truths. Courts were still processing, lawyers were still filing. David was facing consequences that were entirely his own making. And inside, in a small house with a yellow kitchen and a navy blue room full of glow stars and an improperly shaped battleship pancake, Commander Lena Dawid was home. She had survived 5 years of war. She had survived coming home to find her life erased. She had survived grief and fraud and 4 months of legal warfare, and the first terrible weeks of rebuilding a relationship with a daughter who had spent years being told her mother was gone. She had survived all of it because that was what she did. But surviving wasn't the point anymore. Living was. Some doors open and show you the worst thing you've ever seen, but you don't turn around, you don't walk away. You stand your ground, you fight for what's yours, and you find out that the strongest thing a soldier can do isn't charge into battle. It's come home. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that no matter how long you've been gone, and no matter what was built in your absence, the truth always comes home too. The end. Thanks for watching. Subscribe my channel.